Hello watch enthusiasts. Now it's very commonly known that Japan has an incredibly rich watchmaking history, and have been making watches since the start of the 20th century. And in terms of the watches they make, there are a great deal of new innovations from them, such as spring drive, and indeed the creation of various dive watches. And so today I'd like to speak about 5 of the most impressive, historically and indeed in their modern form, watches made by Japanese manufacturers. And of course most of these are manufactured by some branch of Seiko, with Citizen also being involved, but of course this is not to say that there aren't other smaller manufacturers in Japan. It's merely that I feel that these two have contributed the most in terms of the history of Japanese watchmaking. And though this isn't featured in the video, I thought it would be appropriate to show this 25th anniversary version of the 9F quartz movement from Grand Seiko, which really does commemorate a different part of Grand Seiko, and the way that the brand has been able to make quartz movements really very desirable in the luxury segment. However, before I begin the video, I would of course like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is my group on Snups, which is a social media platform, really where you can share pictures of your collections and interests, but specifically on the Watch Guys, you can share your interest for watches, and discuss matters of horology with myself and indeed other enthusiasts, and where I'll do my utmost to reply to any questions or video requests you might happen to give me. And for today's featured picture we have something very topical, because it's a Seiko 5, and a rather beautiful example at that, because of course the first watch in this video is the Seiko 5, the classic from 1963 which has defined modern Seiko. Now back in 1963 when the original Seiko 5 was released, it was designed to be the ultimate everyday timepiece for the working man. Not a piece that was to be expensive or indeed luxurious, but rather a piece which was to accompany someone on every part of their daily commute, their work, and indeed their return home. This was a watch which was designed to be simple, practical, and rather elegant in its designs, and I think it pulled that off extremely well. Because these had a variety of different polished and brushed cases, but they all had various criteria which were crucial to the 5 designation. And these are debated, in fact, because Seiko and collectors say very different things about what these original criteria were. However, what we do know is that they had to incorporate that day-date complication in one window, they had to have an automatic movement, and a recessed crown at 4 o'clock. They also had to have a durable case and bracelet, as well as having the addition of especially on the original models, the Diashock shock resistance features, as well as an unbreakable spring from Seiko, which was the Diaflex mainspring. The watches also had to be, very crucially, resistant to water, and this was still in an era when a lot of dress watches didn't incorporate this, but of course there was the Omega Seamaster from 1948, for example, and the Rolex Oyster, though these were significantly more expensive watches than the Seiko 5. And the movements in these watches were by no means luxurious. They were movements which were rather basic, very simple in-house movements from Seiko, without hacking or hand-winding, but simply having that automatic function. And these movements are known to be some of the most robust mechanical movements ever made. And there are reports, in fact, of these movements running for as long as 20-25 years, without a service, and running accurately during that time. There are also some who even claim that watches from the 1960s are still running without any sort of service, and though of course this isn't advisable if you want to keep a watch running in good condition, and indeed running accurately, it does show just how tough these movements are. And the philosophy of trying to make as resilient a watch as possible is seen in the movement's architecture and design itself, and this applies to all of the movements used in these watches from the 1960s to the present day with the movements that we see today, the calibers 7S, 25, 26, 35 and 36. Is that these are designed to have a great deal of leeway for parts to not be manufactured with the care that a high-end Patek Philippe, for example, would be made with. And this, in my eyes, is just as clever as trying to pack a lot of complications into a watch and create something truly ornate, because they've been able to design a movement which is spectacularly reliable for a period which I imagine wouldn't have been considered back then, in terms of having a watch that would still run for 50 years, say, without any real problems. And the modern versions really do continue this trend, with very well built stainless steel cases, resistant hardlex crystals, as well as exhibition casebacks, so though undecorated you can take a look at the movements, and really take a look at the clockwork that you're getting for between £60 and £100, which is baffling really when you consider the amount of parts, the amount of detail that goes into these watches, and just how much enjoyment they can bring an owner. And of course they also feature the day-date indication, and come in a variety of different cases and case designs, from bead-blasted pilot styles to brushed and polished dress styles, which all have their particular place to sit in the collection. And then of course there are the more modern versions, which aren't just water-resistant, but can be used swimming in the case of the ones with the crown at 3 o'clock, rather than having it at 4 o'clock. and these versions increase the water resistance to 100 metres, which is really the industry standard as far as a watch which is water resistant goes. And so I think these watches are a remarkable part of Seiko's heritage and history, and remain to be interesting to this day, despite the fact they are really the least expensive mechanical watches that are worth their salt on the market. Now the second watch I'd like to talk about is the Seiko Tuna, and more specifically the high-end, top-of-the-range 600 and 1000 metre models. And this was very much Seiko's answer to professional diving in the 1970s. And I've produced a full video on the history of this watch in a full complete package, but I'll give a brief explanation of this watch and why it is such a peculiar looking timepiece. The origins of this watch come in 1968 when a diver requested from Seiko that they produce a watch which could resist saturation diving, and indeed could resist the ingress and extraction of helium from the case during a dive. Because prior to this, the dive watches produced by Seiko had serious problems with regards to the crystals popping off during decompression. And so they created, in 1975, the 6159-7010. And this was a dive watch unlike any other, and in many ways was a response to the same sort of market as the Seamaster Ploprof from Omega, but they responded to this in a very different way. They gave the watch this large shroud which was produced and coated in order to protect the bezel and the workings of the case. It also was built, like the Seamaster Ploprof, to resist the ingress of helium altogether, rather than having a valve to release it, and so as a result was 100 times more resistant to helium ingress than other cases. Like the Omega, these watches also included a caseback, which wasn't in fact an opening caseback, rather was a monoblock design, so you had to lower the movement and the dial in through the front of the watch. And of course this wasn't novel by any stretch because Seiko had used this previously, but only added to the credibility of this watch as a genuine and serious dive watch. The watches also featured a legibility which was unparalleled, with these highly legible hands and a 600 metre water resistance, which made these watches far more water resistant than one would ever need them to be, even if you were indeed one of these professional and experimental divers of this period. However, whilst the Ploprof was originally designed to be titanium, this watch actually was titanium. And this was remarkable because it's incredibly difficult to machine titanium in these particular ways, which Seiko managed very, very well with this timepiece, and does explain why it took 7 years to come to fruition. And this watch also included a mechanical movement, which of course was the standard for that era. But it was really in 1978 that they created the watch which we now accept as the Seiko Tuna in its most spectacular form, and a watch which is still made to this day. And in 1978, the model which replaced the 6159-7010 was the 7549-7009. And this model is a piece which moves this watch from a mechanical watch to a quartz piece. And quartz was of course a very, very novel technology then and extremely expensive, but it did offer much better accuracy, as well as a greater resistance to the elements when it comes to shocks and knocks, as well as anti-magnetism. And so as a result they incorporated that into this watch, and thus with that gave it a day-date complication, as well as the fact that it now had an end-of-life indicator, the idea of which it would, by ticking less frequently, it would give you an idea of the fact that you had very little battery charge left, and that you needed to take it into service for a battery to be replaced. However, the case construction also changed here, because we see the style of titanium changed. Where it used to simply have raw titanium, now it has nitride-coated titanium which comes up this sort of gold colour, which made it much more resistant to the elements. It did, however, continue to use the ceramic shroud, which remained a very, very novel use of ceramics, because of course watches didn't tend to have these. What's very interesting about this watch, though, is the fact that despite the fact that this watch's reference numbers changed, and they were updated over the years to increase the water resistance to 1000 metres, which we have today, these watches in design have remained basically the same. And though there are now less expensive models with 300 metre water resistances, and indeed an opening caseback, as well as 200 metre versions too, this in my eyes will remain the true version of the Tuna. And the beauty of this watch, though, is that for several models, the shrouds are actually interchangeable between the versions from the 70s and the modern models, which does show the way they've stayed true to the original proportions and dimensions, and the way the design really has aged very, very well in terms of remaining functional and indeed relevant for dive watches in the present day. And in terms of modern versions of this watch, there are two real versions available. There is the SBBN 25, which is the 49.4mm by 15.3mm 1000 metre quartz version with the highly accurate 7C46 quartz movement. And this is anti-magnetic and costs around $1,700 with a ceramic shroud and indeed that PVD coated titanium, which gives this very dark look to the whole watch. And this watch was tested, in fact, in the sea by Seiko, and it achieved over 3,000 metres of water resistance, despite the fact that it's only rated for 1,000, which does show just how overbuilt these watches are. And these do still retain the style of day-date indication, and indeed having a monoblock case. And one notable change over the original is that these now feature sapphire crystals. Unlike the hardlex crystals used on a great deal of other marine masters from Seiko, these watches have taken that step up to sapphire just because of its increased hardness and resistant to scratches. But in terms of the automatic counterpart, we now have the SBDX 013 and 014. And these two reference numbers refer to either the fully blacked out version, or the version with a gold nitride coating like the original. And of course my personal favourite is the one with the gold, though I must admit I don't think I could pull off wearing this watch, because it's grown to 52.4mm by 17.2 in thickness, and it of course remains titanium and ceramic. And it does have the Grand Seiko derived 8L35 automatic movement, with 50 hours of power reserve and a relatively high beat of second hand, rather than the lower beat seen in lower end Seikos. This was also tested to 4,300 metres, which makes this really the highest water resistance you can get on any watch which has been tested in the automatic range of watches, because of course the Zin UX does extend beyond this, but this watch itself is the most water resistant watch with an automatic movement which you can buy, as opposed to these experimental watches you often hear about. But the really impressive part about this watch is the fact that this automatic version with the in-house caliber, this incredible water resistance and this unbelievable heritage is $2,800, which is baffling, frankly, by comparison to offerings from Rolex and Omega as to what you can get for this sort of price. Now, the following watch, which is the Citizen EcoDrive 1, doesn't appear all that incredible from its specifications when one first looks at it, because this watch is a stainless steel dress watch with a simple screwed-in bezel, a bracelet or a strap option which define the size of the case, because they do come in two versions, a 40mm version with more smooth lugs, or a 39mm version with sharper ones. It also comes with a quartz movement and a simple two-hand display. However, from then on this watch becomes all the more impressive, because the watch features the Citizen EcoDrive technology, which is of course this very, very famous technology whereby the dial works as a photovoltaic cell, and so as a result the sun's rays, or indeed any light this watch is exposed to, are converted into electricity for the watch to then run on. However, this watch is impressive because it's only 2.98mm thick. Now, to put that into context, the Seiko that we were just talking about was 17.2mm thick. So this watch is unbelievably slim, and that really is shown by the size of the crown, which of course can't be thicker than the watch itself, and so defines the thickness of the watch in relation to the frontal picture of the timepiece very, very well. And as a result of this incredibly thin nature, the watch has had to prove some really very impressive technological feats in order to be able to remain usable at this thickness. Now, the most immediate problem with building a watch like this is rigidity, because of course watches are thick and sizable for a reason in the case of sports watches, and of course this is less important for a dress watch, but even so an ill-timed move of the wrist could be disastrous for this watch's structural integrity. And so as a result, it's stainless steel in its construction, but features a very clever bezel. And the bezel is constructed from Ceramet, which is a proprietary blend of metal and ceramic, in order to make an extremely resistant and strong build, which is then screwed directly into the case via these 4 screws on it. This allows the case to be surprisingly rigid, and as a result results in a watch which is wearable. And the movement itself is also another area which was very impressive, because it only features hours and minutes in order to reduce the height of the dial, but the movement still incorporates 85 parts and has a power reserve of 10 months between exposures to light, meaning it will be very, very usable, and you wouldn't have any problems with it running down. And for a quartz watch, this watch is of course quite costly, costing between $2,600 and $3,500, which is by no means a small amount of money, and so as a result this watch is certainly more of a luxurious quartz watch. However, I think it is worth to remember the fact that this watch is a direct competitor with something like the ultra-slim watches from Piaget, which have been incredibly successful these days, which are of course mechanical, and so as a result do run in a very different price range, well over the £15,000 mark in some cases. And so as a result, this watch is certainly a feat of technology which is actually accessible for a lot of people, and of course still is a highly expensive watch, and that's certainly understandable that it would be beyond the reach of a great many people, and I personally, for example, wouldn't be able to afford a watch like this. However, I do think that for those who can afford it, it offers something really unbelievable, because it is significantly slimmer than the world's most slim mechanical watches, and is the world's slimmest solar-powered watch ever made. Now with the next watch we move up to over 3.5 times the price of that Citizen, and this is the Grand Seiko Spring Drive Chronograph SBGC 203, 201 and 205. And the 201 and 203 are the steel variants of this watch, whilst it also comes in titanium with golden hands and dial accents at the higher price as the 205. Now the reason why I thought this watch should be included, and indeed this watch has been made for quite a while, albeit previously with the Seiko and Grand Seiko branding, whilst now it's moved to only having Grand Seiko on the dial as they become a separate entity. But the reason why I'd like to talk about this watch is because I think technologically, and as a chronograph, it's unmatched on the market. And this is a timepiece which is by no means small, as it's a 43.5mm by 16.1mm timepiece, in, as I've said, titanium or stainless steel, but which is a wonderful demonstration of Grand Seiko's Spring Drive. And Spring Drive is technology which I never tire of talking about, because I think it's a fantastic approach to combining the accuracy of a quartz watch with the beauty and the mechanisation of a mechanical automatic watch. And through the exhibition caseback of this watch, you really can witness the mechanisation at the heart of this timepiece, with a spring which unloads as it unwinds, which provides movement for the glide wheel, which then uses an electromagnetic brake to keep the accuracy of the watch, and so as a result you get a completely smooth flow to the second hand, which of course is perfect for a chronograph, which requires the utmost accuracy. And the technology here really does show itself when you consider the accuracy of this watch, because it is accurate to 10 seconds a month, as opposed to the usual deviation of Seiko movements, which unregulated are generally accurate to about 30 seconds a day. So it does show just the care taken to produce a truly functional movement in a way which is unprecedented. And I feel the functionality of this watch means that in many ways it competes very, very well with something like a Rolex Daytona, which of course is the benchmark for the in-house luxury chronograph. And so as a result, this watch, in many people's eyes, and indeed in my eyes, represents something very different and something incredibly affordable, bearing in mind the fact that it does have this technology, which simply isn't seen elsewhere, inside a case which is beautifully finished with that traditional style of Japanese sword finishing to create those wonderful polished bevels and edges, along with very carefully put in brushing. And of course, whilst the stainless steel version is probably the most conservative version at 187 grams, you really can save weight on this watch if you go for the titanium version, which weighs only 124 grams. And despite the size of that 9R36 movement, it is a wonderfully wearable watch thanks to that lightness on the wrist, and of course those very large pushes are very easily accessed and provide you with a very complete timepiece, having that GMT function, as well as the power reserve and the date, with that chronograph function as well. And I feel it would have been very easy to simply use this slot in the video to talk about the Grand Seiko Snowflake, which is of course that very well-known dress watch from Grand Seiko, with the 41mm titanium case and that wonderfully detailed dial. But I feel this watch does the brand justice in a way which that timepiece simply can't, due to its limited functionality. And the beauty of this watch, in its complexity, I think is exactly what needs to be appreciated, because it's a timepiece which isn't the conventional choice. It's not as recognisable by many as an Omega Speedmaster, as a Rolex Daytona, or even a Hoya Octavia, but in its own way provides something completely different to the industry. And the price of this watch, by comparison to the Rolex Daytona, which you can pay easily £11,000 for, of £7,800 for the steel version or £8,800 for the titanium version, is surprising and in many ways I think remarkable and refreshing in an industry which is so often known for its high prices and inflated prices as well by comparison to what they used to be. Now this final watch in many ways I think represents Japanese watchmaking in a way which no other watch can. And this is a timepiece which is the equivalent in my eyes to what Breguet is to French watchmaking and design, and what Patek Philippe is to Swiss watchmaking and design. This is a timepiece which demonstrates the Japanese care and interest in elegant simplicity, but also perfection in each individual manufacturing technique and part. And this is the Credor HE2. And it's a platinum dress watch, which in many ways appears very unremarkable in photographs. But having seen one at Baselworld and having seen the craftsmanship of these watches, they really are unbelievable. Now the exclusivity of this watch is based on the manufacturing. And whilst Credor is actually owned by Seiko and indeed runs the Spring Drive technology, this is a brand which operates from a single workshop, and so as a result they put out about 30 watches a year. And that's by comparison to the 2,000 Rolex puts out a day. So the exclusivity of this watch truly is legendary. And this is a 39mm by 10.3mm platinum dress watch with the most exquisite of white dials. And starting with the case though, we have this fully polished case with a very simple design, with nothing particularly outlandish, apart from an incredible level of polishing, to a degree which is very, very rarely seen, with care taken even on the crown to create an element of that Credor logo, to really provide the most simple yet best executed finish. This continued to the dial, which is something of true beauty, because it's devised from a particular porcelain that will never fade, and it's designed and produced in a factory which is very near to the workshop, and produced from a pure white colour as a result of using a composition of entirely aluminium oxide without any additions or any additives that would change the colour. The dial of this watch has even been described as almost luminous by certain individuals, and I can certainly see what they mean, because there's this crisp white, snow-white feature to this dial, which is simply unparalleled, and contrasts those thermally blued hands and hand-painted indices, as well as the hand-painted Credor logo, which of course isn't stamped, it is painted, which only gives further interest to this already magnificent dial. And the hands are very simple, in fact, with these simple pointer styles, and then the second hand, which features a very basic style of design, but with that wonderful crescent moon on its counterweight, which just adds to the little details which make this watch. And the caliber 7R14 used in this watch is another aspect of this watch which I think requires some time to appreciate, and certainly took me some time to appreciate in terms of its design. Because unlike an Elang and Zona movement, for example, that jumps out at you in its magnificence, this is a movement that takes a while to drink in, as it has this style of almost poetic placement of the jewels to create the illusion of a landscape, for example, as well as this brushing which continues across its plates without any sort of break, as it appears completely seamless between the bridges, with that river running down across the movement to that large exposed and open worked spring barrel. And that's cut to appear like a sort of a flower, so you can see the spring unwinding in its centre. Then, of course, you have a little blued hand, which shows you the power reserve of 60 hours, which is very useful, and I like the fact they've put it on the case back rather than the dial, which means that when you're wearing it, you can simply enjoy the simplicity, whilst when it's off the wrist, you can enjoy the beauty of the movement, and use that as an indicator. And, of course, the fact that this is manually wound means that you can really appreciate the beauty of the plates. And I must say, in my eyes, I do like manually wound movements, and sadly I don't have any in my collection at the present time, but I would like to acquire a few manually wound movements in future, because I think they do provide such a wonderful view, and a simplicity that an automatic watch, though more practical, simply doesn't provide. And the movement is by no means simply a pretty item, because it does of course still include the spring drive technology, which gives it that wonderful accuracy and that completely smooth second run, which is something you absolutely have to see to believe, because being used to mechanical watches as I am, it's always such a wonder to see these smooth flowing second hands. And along with that, in order to increase the power reserve of this very slim movement, the movement actually features a proprietary technology which means that torque is returned to the mainspring as potential energy if it's not used by the hands, which allows the power reserve to be 25% longer than it would be otherwise despite its slim size, which is again something which I think is wonderful about this watch. And of course, $51,900, it's an extremely expensive luxury timepiece, but I think the exclusivity and the craftsmanship and care that goes into this watch is absolutely unparalleled. And I'll conclude this video here, but do leave your comments down below as to what you thought of these watches, and indeed what you thought I should have included, because I certainly am interested, because there's such a wealth of horology that's come out of Japan, that really I've included only a brief glimpse into what they can produce. So I really am interested to hear what you think. So thank you very much for watching, and if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching, this is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.